Validations allow us to make sure that data meets a set of requirements before it's saved to the database. You can think of them as the rules that our data must follow. We could validate data every time a form is submitted, in other words, put the validation code in our controllers, but that would make it so that the rules are only enforced when we go through one of those controller actions, and we'd end up repeating ourselves every time we had a controller making updates to the same database tables. It's much better to enforce the rules all the time, globally in our application. Since this concerns the application's interaction with the database, the model is the best place for it. That way the rules will be enforced right at the doorway to the database. So we'll use active record validations to define these validation rules in our models. They become part of the intelligence of the model and can be automatically checked anytime the model goes to save the data to the database. If the data doesn't follow the validation's rules, then the model will refuse to complete the save and also keep track of the errors so that we can review them and give the user the opportunity to fix them. In this movie, we'll look at the validation methods that active record validations provides for us to use. And then in the next movie, we'll add some of these to our simple CMS application. In total, there are 10 validation methods that we can use. The first one is validates presence of. We already used this one so that we could take a look at form errors. We call this validation in our model file by adding validates underscore presence underscore of, and then a space, and then a symbol, which is the attribute that we want to validate. The validation can also take a second argument, which is a hash of options for configuring its behavior. Almost all of the validations work the same way. They take an attribute followed by a hash of options. Validates presence of makes sure that the attribute is not blank. Blank in Rails encompasses nil, false, an empty string, a string with only spaces in it, an empty array, and an empty hash. If we have this validation on one of our models and we submit an attribute that's considered blank, then that model will be marked with an error saying that name can't be blank. We can customize the last part of that message by passing in a new message in the options hash. The next validation is validates length of. Here, we're not just interested that there is a value submitted, we're interested in how long the value is, how many characters it has. In this case, we have to pass in something to the options hash so that it knows what parameters we're looking for, what our rule is. So in your model, you would say validates length of, and then the attribute that you wanted to enforce, followed by an option like is, and then whatever the length ought to be. That's what you would use if it was going to be a precise length. We could also pass in minimum if we want to make sure that it's above a certain number, or maximum to ensure that it's below a certain number. You can pass in both minimum and maximum to make sure it's between two numbers, or in that case you can use the shorthand within or in, which is just a synonym for it. You would use the within option followed by a range of values. Instead of a single message for validates length of, there are 3 different message possibilities. One for when you're looking for a precise length, and one for when the value is either too long or too short. We also have a validation for validates numericality of. Here we're making sure that something is a number, either an integer or a floating point number. In addition to checking that it is a number, we can also validate the value of that number by passing in options for equal to, greater than, less than, greater than or equal to, or less than or equal to. We can also test if the number is odd or even, or use only integer if we don't want to allow floating point numbers, but only integers. In every case, the default message is attribute is not a number. You would likely want to customize it if you were using one of those other options. The next validation is validates inclusion of. Here we have a list of choices, and we want to make sure that the value of this attribute is in that set of choices. You would use the option in followed by an enumerable object, such as an array or a range. If it doesn't pass the validation, the error message will say that this attribute is not included in the list. We have the opposite of that too, with validates exclusion of. It does the exact same thing, but it makes sure that a value is not in the list, and the default message is this attribute is reserved. With validates format of, we can examine the value of an attribute to validate its format. We do that using a regular expression. You would pass in the option with, and then the regular expression you want to use. For example, if we need a value to be in the format of 3 letters, followed by 3 numbers, followed by 3 more letters, we could write a regular expression that would make sure that it was in that format. And if it wasn't, it would fail the validation with the message, this attribute is invalid. This is especially handy for checking email addresses and URLs to make sure that they're in the right format. Next, we have validates uniqueness of. This makes sure that the value is not already in the database. A classic case for this is username. So we want to make sure that a username can only exist one time in the database. We want to make sure it's unique. So before we save the username John Doe to the database, we need to actually do a database query to see if there are any other John Does that are in the database. So keep in mind that validates uniqueness of, unlike the other validations, will make a database call when it's doing its job. It's the only way you can know whether this value already exists. We can pass in an option for whether the check should be case sensitive, and you can also pass in one for scope. The idea here is that we might say John Doe is not allowed anywhere, and so we don't want to allow it at all. It's completely unique. Or you might say it's unique only within a certain scope. So company ABC can have a John Doe, and company XYZ can also have a John Doe. In that case, the scope might be the company's ID. What validates uniqueness of is doing is taking the column and using that in its query that it's constructing to find out if the value already exists. And the error message, if something is not unique, will be that this attribute has already been taken. The next one validates acceptance of, and honestly, I don't find this one to be tremendously useful. The idea here is that when we're filling out a form, we might want a user to just check a box agreeing to something, like the terms of service. Validates acceptance of makes sure that that checkbox got checked. It does one other thing for you besides that. Because it's something like the terms of service, it's often something that we don't necessarily want to store in the database. We just want the person to agree to it, but we don't need to actually store that value. So if you don't have a column in your table for it, then validates acceptance of will create a virtual attribute on your model and use that. You don't have to have a column. So we can still have that value checked, but it won't bother saving that value to the database. To the options hash, you can pass in the option for accept, which is what value you're looking for. By default, that's going to be the string 1 because that's what checkboxes will send in the form. The next one has a very similar sounding name, but it does something very different. Validates confirmation of. The idea behind validates confirmation of is making sure that the user typed the data correctly by asking them to enter it a second time. You've probably seen this before, where it says enter your password and then enter your password a second time. We're making sure that the passwords match. Or enter your email address and enter your email address a second time. It does the same kind of virtual attribute that validates acceptance of does. We don't need to save their email confirmation to the database. So instead, validates confirmation of, when it's in your model, it will create a virtual attribute that it can use to make sure that it matches the original attribute. So for example, if we had validates confirmation of email, the virtual attribute would be called email_confirmation. And then we would add that field to our form and they would match up, or else it would fail validation. There's one additional important point that you need to know about validates confirmation of, and that's that Rails will only run this validation if the confirmation attribute has been set to something. In other words, if you don't include it on your form and it's not in the form parameters, then this validation won't run. Now that's a good thing because there may be other forms where we want to update other parts of this object and not deal with whatever field this is that we want to have confirmed. We wouldn't want our validation confirming that the email address was correct to stop us from updating the person's first name, for example. So be careful about that. If the confirmation attribute is passed in, it'll enforce it and make sure that it matches, but if it's not included, it'll just skip over this validation entirely. The last validation is a bit different from the other 9 that we've seen. Validates associated. Instead of checking the current model's data, it validates the data of associated models. In other words, it uses the active record associations like has many and belongs to make sure that the objects related to an object are valid before it will consider the current object valid and let it be saved. You only need to use it when we're creating 2 or more objects in one step, and there's a real dependency between the two. Let's imagine that a user is going to create an auction for a car. The user fills out the auction details, such as the minimum bid, and the car information, the year, the model, the color, and they do that all on one form. When they submit the form, we need to save the auction to the auctions table, and we'll save its has won relationship of the car to the cars table. We save the auction first, and it passes all validations, and it saves to the database. Next, we save the car, and we discover that the user forgot to put in the color of the car. So it fails the validations, and it can't save the car. We want to redisplay the form to the user so that the user can add the color and then resubmit it. But we've already saved a record for the auction. We'd need to delete that record so that we could resave a new record when they resubmit the form. Instead, it would be better if we could look ahead and see that the car is going to be invalid before we save the auction. The 2 models are so closely related that we should consider the auction invalid unless the car is also valid. With validates associated, instead of having an attribute be the first value that we're passing in as an argument, you're going to pass in the association name. And it's then going to call valid on the object or the array of objects to find out if they're valid or not. That's going to run all of their validations. One important note is that it does not fail this validation if the associated object does not exist. You would also want to use validates presence of that object to make sure that the object does exist. And last, beware of infinite loops and long cascades. You obviously wouldn't want to have one model that was asking to validate another model, which in turn was asking to validate that first model again, right? The dependency can only go one way. And by long cascades, I mean be careful that you don't have too many objects in the chain of dependencies. Last of all, I just want to look at a couple of other global options that you can use with these validations. For most of these methods, they're going to accept the options for allow nil and allow blank. So if you want to allow it to skip the validation, if it hasn't been submitted, or if you want to allow them to put in empty strings, well then you can use allow nil or allow blank. Now of course, a method like validates presence of isn't going to allow you to skip blank because that negates its whole reason for existing, but most of the other validations will. There are two more important options that you can pass in. One is for on, so that you can pass in either save, create, or update, and that will tell this validation when it should run. You may want to run a validation only for new records, in which case you would use onCreate. Or you would want to run the validation only for existing records that have already been stored in the database one time. Then you would run it for onUpdate. Or save, which is the default, which says that we would run the validation in both cases, both for creating records and for updating records. And then last of all, we have if and unless. You can use if and then provide a method name, or unless and provide a method name, and this validation will run only if that method returns true or false. So we would need to define a method in our model. That method could do whatever business we want it to do, but at the end of the day, it needs to return true or false. So for example, we could validate that a user has given us their email address only if they've asked to be notified by email. So now we've looked at all 10, and that gives you a really good overview of validations and what they can do for you. Now in the next movie, let's try some of these out on our simple CMS application.